She had traveled 2,400 miles to marry a stranger from a letter. But on her 90-day trial in that lonely cabin, she did not know one of the three brothers was hiding a truth that could kill her, and another was already against his will falling in love with her. This is the story of the letter that brought Adelaide Thornberry to Bitterroot and the winter that almost buried her there. The cold had a sound that night. It was a high, thin keening that did not just touch the skin, it vibrated in the teeth and settled into the bones like an unwelcome guest who had come to stay. Adelaide Mary Thornberry pulled the wool of her traveling cloak tighter around her slender shoulders, but the wind found every gap in the weave. It always found the gaps. She had learned that much in 3 days of travel from Helena, Montana territory. She stood alone on the wooden platform of Trading Post Junction, the last stagecoach stop before the wilderness swallowed the road whole. The driver, a grizzled old man named Hank Miller, who had not spoken more than 10 words to her in 2 days, had unloaded her single carpet bag and her father's black leather medical satchel onto the boards beside her. He had taken her last fare in coins, tipped his hat without meeting her eyes, and climbed back onto his buckboard. "I won't be here when the Whitlock men come," he had said almost as an afterthought. "Best of luck to you, miss." Then he was gone, the wagon rattling away into the falling dusk, leaving Adelaide standing on the platform of a station that had no walls, no shelter, no roof, just a wooden floor surrounded by a vast and indifferent country. The mountains rose around her like the walls of a cathedral, but no cathedral she had ever seen in Boston had been this tall, this jagged, this absolutely unmoved by human concern. The Bitterroot Range. She had read the name on maps 1,000 times during the long crossing from Massachusetts. The word had sounded almost romantic on her father's tongue when he had pointed to it on the old atlas in his study the year before he died. Now the word felt different. It felt like a warning. A single wolf cried somewhere in the timber to the north. The sound rolled down the ridge and broke against the stone. Adelaide pressed a gloved hand to her chest and felt her heart hammering beneath the wool. She had traveled 2,400 miles. She had ridden 3 trains, 1 steamboat, and 4 stagecoaches. She had read the letter so many times the paper had begun to soften at the folds. The letter had promised a home. The letter had lied. She closed her eyes for a moment and forced herself to breathe slowly, the way her father had taught her when patients in Charlestown grew panicked beneath his hands. In through the nose, out through the mouth, count the breaths, slow the heart, steady the hand. The body, Dr. Nathaniel Thornberry had told her once, listens to the mind, but only if the mind speaks gently. A father is gone, a house is gone, a reputation is gone. But she was still here. She was 23 years old, alive, and standing on the threshold of a country that did not yet know her name. She opened her eyes. 3 riders were emerging from the tree line at the far end of the clearing. They came on horseback 3 abreast, picking their way carefully along the rutted track that passed for a road in this country. Even at 100 yards, she could see they were enormous. Even sitting astride their horses, they made the animals look small. They wore heavy buffalo coats that fell almost to their knees, fur trapper hats pulled low against the wind, and rifles across their saddles. They carried themselves with the easy, weather-worn confidence of men who lived where most people died. Adelaide stood very still and watched them come. The wolf cried again, closer this time. She did not flinch. She had no road back. The stagecoach was gone. Bitterroot Junction was 40 miles in one direction, and the cabin of the Whitlock brothers somewhere in those mountains was the only place she had left to go. She gripped the handle of the medical satchel until her knuckles went white inside her gloves, and she tried to remember the words her father had spoken on his deathbed. "Be brave, my Addie. The world is not as cruel as it seems. There are good men still. You only have to look." She prayed he had been right. Before we go any further into our story tonight, if you are new here at Frontier Rescue Stories, please tap that subscribe button. I share new tales of the Old West every week, stories of the men and women who built this country with their own hands and their own faith. Drop me a line in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. Tell me whether you believe in the long hand of Providence. Now let us return to Adelaide, standing on that empty platform, watching 3 strangers ride out of the wilderness toward her. The first rider broke ahead of the others as they drew near. He was the largest of the 3, broad in the shoulder as a barn door, and the chestnut horse beneath him snorted steam into the freezing air. He wore a full, dark beard frosted with ice. A pale scar ran across his left eyebrow like a thin line of chalk. When he reined his horse in 20 feet from the platform and looked down at her, his eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and there was nothing warm in them. He did not dismount. He did not greet her. He simply looked at her head to toe, the way a man might look at a horse he was thinking about buying and had already decided against. "Miss Thornberry," he said. His voice was low and grinding like stone on stone. "Yes, sir." "My brother Tobias wrote to you." "Yes, sir." Then you understand that I did not. Adelaide swallowed. The wind cut through her cloak and found the linen beneath. I understood from his letter, Mr. Whitlock, that he was acting with the consent of his family, but that word means different things in different houses. He turned his head slightly, just enough that she could see the second rider coming up alongside him. This one was not quite as broad through the chest leaner in the face, with dark blonde hair grown to his collar and a short trimmed beard. He wore the same fur and the same kind of rifle, but where the eldest brother carried himself like a man who expected to be obeyed, this one carried himself like a man who expected very little from anything at all. His eyes were slate gray, and they met hers only briefly before sliding away to study the line of the trees. The third rider came forward last, and he was the only one who smiled, like Adelaide. He swung down from his saddle in a single fluid motion, dropped his reins over the hitching rail without looking, and crossed the platform in 3 long strides. He was younger than the other two. Auburn hair fell across his forehead in a thick boyish lock. He had a clean-shaven jaw with light stubble coming through warm hazel eyes, and the open, hopeful face of a man who had never quite learned to mistrust the world. Adelaide, I am so sorry. We rode as fast as we dared, but the bridge over Cold Creek was iced over, and we had to take the long way around. How long have you been standing here? You must be frozen clean through. He did not wait for her to answer. He shrugged out of his buffalo coat and swung it around her shoulders before she could protest. The coat was so heavy it nearly buckled her knees. It smelled of pine smoke and wool grease and a faint trace of cedar, and it was warm. It was warm in a way she had not been warm in 3 days. She looked up into his face and found him grinning at her with such relief that her eyes filled with tears. "You are Tobias," she said. "Toby, please. Just Toby. You look exactly the way you described yourself." "Well, that is a relief. I was afraid I had oversold the matter." She laughed, and the laughter caught in her throat and turned to a single sob she was not quick enough to swallow. Toby's smile faltered for just a moment, and then he gathered himself and reached out and took her gloved hand in his own. "Come on now, you are all right. You are all right, Adelaide. You are home." The eldest brother spoke from horseback. "Tobias, mount up. The storm is closer than I like." Toby flinched at the tone, but did not turn around. "Ezra, give the woman a moment." "She can have her moment in the saddle. We have 4 hours to ride, and the temperature is dropping." The middle brother, the quiet one with the slate gray eyes, finally swung down from his horse. He did not speak. He simply walked over to Adelaide's bags, picked up the carpet bag in one hand and the medical satchel in the other, and weighed the satchel a moment longer than the bag. He looked at her. "This is heavy for a woman's traveling case," he said. His voice was deeper than Toby's, quieter than Ezra's. Something in it made the hair on Adelaide's neck rise in a way she did not yet understand. "It belonged to my father. He was a physician. Was. He died in March, sir." The middle brother nodded once. He did not say he was sorry for her loss. He simply tied the bags to the saddle of his horse with practiced fingers, and he did it carefully, as if he understood that the satchel contained more than tools. "My name is Silas," he said. He did not offer his hand. He turned and walked back to his horse, and Adelaide stood there in Toby's enormous coat, watching the second of the 3 Whitlock brothers move with the silent economy of a man who had spent a long time learning not to waste any motion at all. Toby touched her elbow gently. "Come, you will ride with me. Silas's horse is carrying your bags, and Ezra's will not suffer a stranger close enough to share a saddle. Are you afraid of horses?" "No." "Have you ridden much?" "In the parks of Boston only, side saddle, with a tutor." He laughed softly. "Well, tonight you ride astride and you ride with me. Hold on to my belt and lean when I lean. We will go slow. The trail is good as far as the river crossing." He helped her up onto the back of his big sorrel gelding behind the cantle of the saddle and then swung up himself in front of her. She had never sat a horse this way in her life. She had never sat this close to a man in her life. Toby reached back and caught her hands and brought them around his waist, settling them at the front of his belt where she could grip the leather. "Hold on tight," he said over his shoulder, and his voice was kind, "and do not be afraid. We will get you home before the snow." Adelaide pressed her gloved hands against the leather of his belt and felt the heat of him through the wool and the fur. She was 23 years old. She had never been touched by a man who was not her father or a doctor. Her heart beat so hard against the cage of her ribs that she was certain Toby could feel it through his back. She closed her eyes for a moment and tried to remember her father's voice. The voice that had told her when she was a small girl afraid of the dark that bravery was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk forward in spite of it. The horses turned toward the timber and began to climb. The track up out of Trading Post Junction climbed for the first hour, switching back and forth across the slope of black timber and dry stone. The light bled out of the sky as they rode. By the time they reached the first ridge, the world had gone the color of old pewter, and the cold had teeth. Ezra rode point, Silas rode rear guard. Toby and Adelaide rode in the middle, where the snow on the trail was already broken by the first horse, and where Toby explained over his shoulder she would be hardest for any wolf or bear to take. He said the word wolf the way a Boston man would have said hackney, as if it were a thing one negotiated with. They did not speak much. The mountains did not invite speech. After the first hour, the wind dropped suddenly, the way it sometimes does in the high country before the snow, and a great silence settled over the timber. Adelaide could hear nothing but the creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves on packed snow, and the slow fog of her own breath rising past Toby's shoulder. Once, only once, she looked back over her shoulder at Silas Whitlock. He was riding 50 yards behind them, his rifle laid across the front of his saddle, his slate-gray eyes scanning the trees on either side of the trail. He did not see her looking at him. Or if he did not show it. The brim of his fur hat was pulled low over his brow, and his face was set in lines so still they could have been carved. Adelaide turned forward again. Her chest felt strange. She told herself it was the altitude. 2 hours into the ride, Ezra raised his hand without turning around, and the small column halted in a stand of timber where the snow had been blown off the trail by some quirk of the wind. He swung down from his horse, walked back along the line, and pulled a leather flask out of his coat pocket. "Drink," he said, holding it out to her. "Just a sip." She hesitated. "It is brandy. It will keep your blood up the rest of the way. Do not drink more than a swallow." She took the flask and drank. The brandy burned all the way down and brought tears stinging to the corners of her eyes. She handed it back and managed to thank him without coughing. Ezra did not smile, but he nodded once, which she understood somehow was the same thing. He passed the flask to Toby, who drank, and then Silas rode up alongside and accepted it without dismounting. Silas drank only a small sip. Adelaide watched him, and she noticed the way his hand shook slightly as he capped the flask. Just a tremor. Most men would have missed it. She had spent 10 years standing at her father's elbow, watching hands shake. She knew tremor when she saw it. It was not the cold. Silas met her eyes. He saw her seeing it. He gave the flask back to Ezra without a word, turned his horse, and rode back to his place at the rear of the column. Adelaide felt her cheeks go hot beneath the cold, and she was suddenly very glad Toby could not see her face. They rode on. 2 more hours passed before they came down off the second ridge into a narrow valley cut by a frozen creek, and there, set back against a wall of dark pines, Adelaide saw the cabin for the first time. It was larger than she had imagined. Old Jeremiah Whitlock had built the original 4 rooms with his own hands in the year 1855, and his 3 sons had added on as time and timber permitted. The building rose 2 stories at one end, where a sleeping loft had been framed, and above the main room, a great stone chimney climbed the west wall, throwing a thick ribbon of wood smoke against the iron sky. A barn of equal size stood 30 yards off with a corral attached, and beyond the corral, a smokehouse and a spring house and a small log structure Adelaide would later learn was the ice house. It was a working homestead, not a romance from a letter, a working homestead in a country where work was the only thing that kept a family alive. Toby reined the sorrel in at the hitching rail, swung down, and reached up to help Adelaide off the horse. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her when she touched the ground. She had been in the saddle for 4 hours, and her thighs and her lower back had passed pain an hour ago and arrived somewhere on the far side of numbness. Toby caught her under the elbow and steadied her without comment. "Slow now," he said. "You will get the feeling back in your legs in about 10 minutes. Until then, walk like an old woman and do not be embarrassed about it." Silas tied off the horses and carried her bags up to the porch. Ezra stood in the dooryard a moment, looking up at the sky, reading something in it that Adelaide could not see. Then he walked to the cabin door, pushed it open, and held it for her. "After you, Miss Thornberry." She crossed the threshold. The first thing she felt was the warmth. The cabin was lit by a great fire in the stone hearth and by 2 oil lamps set at either end of a long puncheon table, and the air inside was so much warmer than the air outside that her eyes began to water immediately. The second thing she noticed was the smell. Wood smoke and bear grease and tanned leather and dried herbs. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of a place that men had lived in for a long time without women. The third thing she noticed was the violin. It hung on the wall above the hearth in a leather case open at the front, so the dark, polished wood of the instrument could breathe. It was a very fine instrument. It did not belong to this cabin. It did not belong to these men. Someone had put it on that wall the way a man hangs a portrait of a dead saint. Adelaide felt Ezra Whitlock stop behind her in the doorway. "That belonged to Cordelia," he said. The words came out of him flat as a board. "Cordelia." "My wife." He said the word "my wife" and not "my late wife." Adelaide's stomach turned over once slowly. She did not know yet how to read this man, but she knew enough not to ask the next question that wanted to come out of her mouth. "It is a beautiful instrument," she said instead. "It is." He moved past her into the room and went directly to a roll-top desk in the corner. He opened a drawer, took out a folded sheet of legal paper, and laid it on the table beneath one of the lamps. He smoothed it flat with the heel of his hand, then he turned and looked at her. "Sit down, Miss Thornbury." "Yes, sir." She sat. Toby and Silas had come in behind her, bringing her bags. Toby set the carpet bag on the floor beside her chair. Silas set the medical satchel on the table. He set it carefully, the way a man sets down a thing that might be more important than it looks. Then both brothers stepped back, and there was a silence in which Adelaide became suddenly and acutely aware of how alone she was. "Read this," Ezra said, and he pushed the paper across the table toward her. She picked it up. It was a contract. It had been written in a careful schoolmaster's hand, and it had been dated the day before. It set out in plain English the terms under which Miss Adelaide Mary Thornbury of Boston, Massachusetts, would be permitted to remain at the Whitlock homestead in the Bitterroot Range of Montana Territory. A trial period of 90 days, room and board provided, a locked bedroom of her own, no claim upon her person, no assumption of marriage. At the end of 90 days, if she had borne the work of the homestead without complaint, if she had not fled, if she had not taken sick or made herself a burden, then and only then would she be permitted to marry Tobias Whitlock in the spring with Ezra Whitlock's blessing as head of the household. If she failed any of these terms, she would be returned to Boston at Whitlock expense with $25 in her hand for her trouble. It was signed already by Ezra. There was a blank line for her signature. Adelaide read it twice, then she set the paper down. "This is not a marriage agreement, Mr. Whitlock. This is a probation." "That is correct." "Did Tobias know you were going to ask me to sign this?" Toby spoke from behind her, his voice tight. "Adelaide, I did not know about the paper." Ezra did not turn around. Tobias placed an advertisement for a wife without asking the head of his household. He wrote 3 months of letters to a woman he had never seen. He sent for her and used family money to pay her fare. "I am the one who must keep this homestead alive through the winter. I am the one who must answer for her if anything happens to her. I am the one who must put her in the ground beside Cordelia if the mountain takes her." He turned then. His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw the thing beneath the coldness, and the thing beneath the coldness was fear. "I will not be responsible for the death of a second woman in this house, Miss Thornbury. If you cannot survive the winter, I want to know now." Adelaide held his gaze. She thought about her father's voice. She thought about the empty house in Boston and the dead notice from the bank. She thought about Edmund Pemberton, the merchant who had cornered her at the top of the back stairs, and the way she had pushed him and the way the law had been on his side and not on hers. She thought about every door that had closed behind her. She thought about the medical satchel sitting on the table in front of her, the satchel that contained her father's scalpels and his bottle of Joseph Lister's carbolic acid and his copy of Gray's Anatomy with notes in the margins in his careful left-handed script. She picked up the pen Ezra had set beside the contract. "Mr. Whitlock," she said, "I will give you 90 days, but I am not coming into your house only to keep it. My father was a physician of Boston, and he taught me everything he knew. I have stitched wounds and set bones since I was 12 years old. I have delivered more than 30 babies in the tenements of Charlestown. I will earn my place in this house, but I will earn it not as a wife only. I will earn it as a healer. I will earn it with my hands." The words came out of her steadier than she felt. She set the pen to the paper and signed her name in full. "Adelaide Mary Thornbury." She set the pen down. Ezra Whitlock looked at her for a long moment. She could not tell what he was thinking. She did not know yet that no one in this house could ever tell what he was thinking. He picked up the paper, folded it in half, and slipped it into the breast pocket of his coat. "There is a room at the end of the hall," he said. "It belonged to my mother. It is clean. The bed has been aired. Tobias will bring up your things. We rise at 5. Breakfast is at 6. We work until sundown. There is a wash basin in the room and a chamber pot beneath the bed, and there is a key in the lock on the inside of the door. Use it." He turned and walked out of the room. He had not welcomed her once. Toby exhaled a breath he must have been holding for an hour. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took her hand, and his hand was very warm. "He is not always like this," he said quietly. "I am sorry, Adelaide. I will speak to him." "Do not." "He had no right." "He had every right, Toby. This is his house. I am the stranger in it. Let me prove myself before you fight him on my behalf." He looked at her with such open, undisguised admiration that her chest ached. Across the room, standing with his shoulder against the door frame, Silas Whitlock watched them both. When Adelaide glanced up, his slate-gray eyes met hers, and something passed between them. She did not have a word for it then. She would not have a word for it for many weeks. She knew only that the man who had said almost nothing to her since she arrived had just decided something about her, and she did not yet know what. He pushed off the door frame and walked away into the back of the house, and the boards creaked softly beneath his boots. Outside, the wind was rising again. The first storm of winter was beginning to fall. Adelaide lay awake for a long time that night. Her room was small and clean. The bed was a rope bed strung tight with a tick mattress over it, dressed in heavy wool blankets and a quilt that someone long ago had pieced from scraps of calico and gingham. A small iron stove squatted in the corner with a pipe running up through the ceiling, and Toby had laid a fire in it before he left her, so the room held a steady, drowsy warmth. A wash basin stood on a pine stand by the door. A small mirror thumb-sized hung above it. There was nothing else. She had unpacked her carpet bag by the light of a single tallow candle. She had hung her 2 everyday dresses on pegs along the wall. She had laid out her mother's Bible on the table beside the bed. She had set the locket with her parents' likenesses next to the Bible. She had set the medical satchel at the foot of the bed, and she had not opened it. She had put on her flannel nightgown and braided her hair, and she had blown out the candle, and she had crawled beneath the heavy quilt and locked the door from the inside, exactly as Ezra Whitlock had instructed her to do. And then she had not slept. The wind had picked up after midnight. It hammered the cabin in long, rolling gusts that made the timbers creak. She could hear the snow ticking against the small 4-paned window above her bed. Somewhere far off in the timber, a wolf was singing, and a second wolf answered, and then a third, and the song moved through the trees and faded, and the silence afterward was somehow louder than the singing. She lay on her back and stared up into the dark and listened to a house full of strangers. She heard Ezra moving in the front room for a long time, the slow creak of his weight on the boards, the clink of a glass on a table, the scrape of a chair. He was not sleeping either. After a while, she heard another set of footsteps lighter come into the room and stop. She could hear the murmur of 2 voices through the wall, but she could not make out the words. The words rose, fell, rose again. Then Ezra's voice came clearly low and shaking with a restraint that frightened her. "You did a foolish thing, Tobias. It has been 8 years, Ezra. You cannot live alone forever just because of... Do not speak her name. Cordelia would not want you to live like this." A glass slammed down on a table. Adelaide flinched. "You do not know what Cordelia wanted. She died because of me. Do not stand in this room and tell me what she would have wanted." Silence. Then Toby's voice, softer, almost pleading. "Then let this woman live in this house in peace. She has nothing left out there, Ezra. Let the spring come and let me marry her, and then maybe she will be the thing that brings you back to yourself." A long pause. "She is not Cordelia." "I know. And she is not coming back." "I know that too." The footsteps moved away. Adelaide pressed both hands over her mouth in the dark and made no sound at all. She had been in the Whitlock house 6 hours, and she already knew 3 things she had not been told. Cordelia had been Ezra's wife. Cordelia had died here, and Ezra Whitlock blamed himself for it in a way that had not healed and might never heal in 8 years. She rolled onto her side and pulled the quilt up to her chin. She did not know how long she lay there, perhaps an hour, perhaps 2. The fire in the stove burned low, the room cooled. At last she slid out from beneath the covers, pulled her wool wrapper over her nightgown, picked up her candle and lit it from the embers and unlocked the door. She told herself she only wanted a drink of water from the pump in the kitchen. She walked down the hall as quietly as she could. The front room was empty. The fire on the hearth had burned to a red bed of coals. Cordelia's violin gleamed dully on the wall above it. Adelaide crossed the room to the kitchen, drew a tin cup of water from the pail on the sideboard, and stood drinking it slowly with her back to the porch door. She felt the cold air on her ankles before she heard the latch. She turned. The porch door was open. A man was sitting on the rough plank bench just outside his back to her, a pipe glowing red in his cupped hand. He had heard her come. He must have heard her. He did not turn around. "You should be sleeping, Miss Thornberry." It was Silas. She set the cup down on the sideboard. She thought about going back to her room. She did not. She took her wrapper tighter around her shoulders, opened the door wider, and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit her like a hand against the chest. The snow was falling in great soft flakes that came straight down through the still air. There was no wind now. The storm had paused to breathe. The clearing in front of the cabin was already 3 inches deep in fresh white powder, and the only sound was the soft hiss of the snow striking itself. Silas did not look up. She sat down on the far end of the bench, 2 feet from him. The bench was made of 2 halves of a split log laid over stone. It was cold even through the wool of her wrapper. "You should not have come out here," he said. "I could not sleep." "That is not what I meant." "I know." He drew on his pipe. The bowl flared red, lit his face for a moment in profile, and went dark again. She had seen the profile only briefly in the firelight inside the cabin. She had not seen it like this. The straight nose with its small character bend halfway down, the hollow beneath the cheekbone, the tight line of his jaw above the short trimmed beard. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been carved out of harder country than most. "My brother is a good man," he said. "Yes, sir." "Drop the sir. We are not going to keep that up out here." "Yes, Silas." He almost smiled. She saw it pass across his face and disappear. "My brother is a good man," he said again, "and he means every word he wrote to you, but he is also lonely, and he is dreaming. He fell in love with the way you put your sentences together on paper with a woman he had never seen. He does not know you yet. He thinks he does. He does not. Why are you telling me this? Are you because you should know what is going to happen in the spring, and what is going to happen in the spring." He took the pipe out of his mouth and looked at it as if it had said something he disagreed with. "I do not know," he said, "but I know that my brother is going to find out you are a woman and not a letter, and he is going to have to decide all over again whether he loves you, and so will you. And 90 days is not a very long time for two strangers to learn that about each other. You speak as if you have given this a great deal of thought." "I have." "Why?" He turned his head and looked at her then fully for the first time. The slate gray eyes in the dim light from the doorway were not cold at all. They were tired. They were tired in the way of a man who had been awake for too many years. "Because I watched my brother Ezra fall in love with a stranger once before," he said, "and it ended the way it ended. I would not see another woman buried on this mountain, Miss Thornberry, so I am telling you. Pay attention to who he is, not who he wrote himself to be in the letters, and pay attention to who you are, not who you wrote yourself to be in answering." He turned away from her again. The snow fell. Adelaide sat very still for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "May I ask you a question, Silas?" "You may ask." "That does not mean you will answer." He almost smiled again. "Few things do in this country." "How did Cordelia die?" He did not move. He did not breathe for a moment. The pipe in his hand had gone out. He held it as if he had forgotten what it was for. "That is not my story to tell," he said at last. "It belongs to my brother. If he ever decides to tell it to you, you will know that he has decided to let you in. And if he never decides—" Silas was quiet for so long she thought he was not going to answer at all. "Then you will know that too," he said. He stood up. He was even taller standing than he had been sitting beside her. He walked to the door and turned in the doorway and looked back at her, and she could not read his face. "Good night, Miss Thornberry. Adelaide," he paused. "Good night, Adelaide." He went inside. She sat alone on the porch for a long time after that, watching the snow come down in the silent dark, and at some point she realized she had begun to cry without knowing it, and she did not know whether she was crying for her father, or for her old life in Boston, or for a woman named Cordelia she would never meet, or for the stranger inside the cabin who had warned her to be careful and would not say his real reason why. She wiped her face on the cuff of her wrapper. She went back inside. She locked her door. And sometime in the long, blue hour before dawn, she finally slept. The first morning of the rest of her life began at 5 o'clock in the dark with the sound of an iron bell. Toby had warned her about the bell. Ezra rang it to wake the house. She had been asleep perhaps 2 hours when it cut through her dreams, and she sat up so fast she struck her head on the low slope of the eaves above the bed. By the time she had dressed in her work dress, the heavy gray wool one Toby had told her to wear, and braided her hair and splashed her face with water so cold it took her breath she could hear the men in the kitchen and smell coffee and bacon and wood smoke. She came out into the front room with her medical satchel in her hand. She did not know why she had brought it. She thought perhaps it was to remind herself who she was. The brothers were already at the table, Ezra at the head, Silas at his right, Toby at his left. There was a fourth place set, a tin plate, and a mug of coffee at the foot of the table. Toby smiled at her and stood up to pull the chair out. Ezra looked at her dress, looked at the satchel in her hand, and frowned. "You will not need that today, Miss Thornberry." "Perhaps not, Mr. Whitlock, but my father carried it every day of his working life, and I find I sleep better with it where I can see it." A short silence. Then Silas, without looking up from his plate, "Let her have her satchel, Ezra. It does no harm on the floor by her chair." Ezra grunted. It was not approval. It was not disapproval. It was simply the sound of a man who had been overruled by a quiet voice and had decided not to fight about it. Before breakfast, she set the bag down beside her chair. She sat. Toby poured her coffee. The coffee was black and so strong it made her eyes water. She drank it without comment. She ate the bacon and the cornbread and the fried potatoes Toby put on her plate, and she ate everything, even though her stomach was a knot of nerves, because she understood without anyone telling her that food in this house was not to be wasted. After breakfast, Ezra rose. "Tobias, you are on the woodlot today. We need a cord and a half before the next storm. Silas, the south fence is down from the elk. I want it back up before sundown, Miss Thornberry." Yes, Mr. Whitlock. You will help with the kitchen and the laundry and the hen house, and you will not leave sight of the cabin without one of us. Yes, Mr. Whitlock. There is a chest at the foot of my bed in the back room. It contains clothes that belong to Cordelia. They were good clothes. They were practical. They will fit you. Tobias will fetch them out. You will not work in that Boston dress. It will be ruined by mid-morning, and we cannot replace it. He set his coffee mug down on the table with a small final click. Welcome to the Whitlock homestead, Miss Thornberry. The mountain does not care whether you live or die, so we will. Now let us get to work. He picked up his rifle from the rack beside the door and walked out into the snow. Adelaide sat very still at the table. In her chest, two things happened at once. The first was a slow, cold understanding that for the next 90 days she would be wearing the dresses of a dead woman. The second was that she lifted her chin and she stood up from her chair and she said to no one in particular and to all three brothers at once, I will be ready in 10 minutes. She walked back down the hall to her room and she closed the door. And outside the cabin window, the snow that had begun the night before went on falling soft and steady and merciless, burying the trail to Trading Post Junction inch by inch until by noon there would be no road at all between Adelaide Thornberry and the world she had left behind. She did not know it yet, but she had already stopped being a guest in this house. She had become a member of it. And before the spring came, before the bitterroot bloomed white in the meadows and the chinook blew warm down the long valleys, she would learn that one of the three men sitting at that breakfast table was hiding a truth that could kill her, and one of them was already quietly and against his will beginning to fall in love. The first week of Adelaide Thornberry's life on the Whitlock homestead taught her three things she had not known about herself in 23 years in Boston. The first was that her hands were stronger than she had thought. The second was that her back was weaker than she had thought. The third was that a woman who had been raised in a tenement city surrounded by the constant noise of horses and streetcars and shouting men and crying children did not understand what silence was. Real silence, mountain silence, the kind that pressed in on the ears at night and made a person think the world had stopped breathing. She learned the rhythm of the homestead the way a person learns a new language by being dropped into the middle of a country where no one speaks anything else. There was no instruction, there was only the work, and the work taught her. She learned to start the kitchen fire from the banked coals before sunrise splitting kindling with a small hand axe Toby had sharpened for her on the second morning. By the third day, she could scald the milk pail and the butter churn in water she had heated herself faster than Toby could split a log. The four hens in the hen house soon learned her hand. One of them was a biter, one was a layer, one was simply old and would have to be culled before spring. The path to the spring house iced over twice a day in this weather, so she learned to carry a small bucket of wood ash to scatter on the way so she would not fall and break her hip the way an old woman in Charlestown had broken her hip the winter Adelaide was 16. Her muscles ached in places she had not known had muscles, and she liked it. That was the part that surprised her. In Boston, she had spent her days in the close smoke-filled rooms of her father's small practice, holding basins, threading needles, sterilizing instruments in pots of boiling water. She had been useful, but she had been still. Here she was never still. Her body was always moving, and at the end of each long, exhausting day, when she lay down on the rope bed in her tiny room and pulled the heavy quilt up to her chin, her body felt used in a way that was not unpleasant. It felt like an instrument that was finally being played. The brothers watched her. She knew they were watching. She did not let on that she knew. Ezra watched the way a foreman watches a new hand. He marked which tasks she did well and which she did poorly. When she lifted a too heavy pail of milk from the spring house on the third morning and slopped half of it on the snow, he said nothing. He simply walked over, picked up the pail, carried it inside, and on the fourth morning, a smaller pail had appeared on the hook by the door. He did not point it out to her. He did not expect to be thanked. The smaller pail was simply there. Toby watched her the way a man watches the woman he has decided he is going to marry. He watched her with hope and pride and a kind of nervous, eager attentiveness that sometimes made Adelaide want to put her hand on his arm and say, "Slow down, Toby. We have 90 days. We do not have to settle the question by Tuesday." But she did not say it. She did not yet know how to say it. Silas watched her the way a man watches the surface of a frozen river when he is not sure whether the ice will hold. She caught him at it sometimes. She would look up from kneading bread on the long pine table, her hair falling out of its braid and dusted with flour, and she would catch him standing in the doorway with his rifle in his hand on his way back from the south fence or the trap line, and his slate gray eyes would be on her, and they would not look away. Not at first. Not for a half a heartbeat. Then he would touch the brim of his hat, almost without meaning to, and turn and be gone. She did not know what to do with those half a heartbeats. She tucked them away in some quiet inner place she had not used before. Toby gave her her first lesson with the rifle on the 8th day. She had asked Ezra at the supper table the night before whether she might learn to shoot. She had said quietly that her father had owned a small revolver in Boston for the protection of the practice, and that he had taught her to load it, but not to fire it, and that she did not wish to be a woman in this country who could not protect herself if every man in the house was on the far side of the homestead at the wrong moment. Ezra had not answered. He had looked at her over the rim of his coffee mug for a long second, and then he had looked at Silas. Silas had said, without lifting his eyes from his plate, "I will take her tomorrow afternoon." So when the morning chores were done and the dinner dishes had been washed, Silas met her on the back porch with two rifles. The smaller of the two was a single-shot Sharp's carbine lighter in the hand, then the Winchester he carried himself, and he handed it to her without ceremony. "This was my mother's," he said. "She taught herself to shoot the year my father died. She kept it loaded by the door for 20 years. Your mother is gone too. She has been gone a long time." He led her out behind the barn where the slope of the meadow rose against a stand of dark timber, and where he explained no stray ball would carry beyond the trees, and put a hole in something that mattered. He set up 3 tin cans on a fallen log at 30 paces. He showed her how to load the rifle, how to set the hammer, how to brace the stock against her shoulder so the recoil would not bruise her collarbone. He showed her how to breathe. "You do not pull the trigger," he said. "You squeeze it. You let the rifle decide when it is ready to fire. Your hand is just the last part of the conversation." She raised the rifle. She was so cold, her hands were shaking. She lowered it again. "I cannot hold it steady." "That is because you are thinking about it." How do I stop thinking about it?" "You think about something else." He stepped behind her then. She felt him before she saw him, the warmth of him at her back, blocking the wind. He reached around her with his right hand and laid his hand over hers on the stock of the rifle, and with his left he set her elbow at the angle he wanted, and he did not stand particularly close to her, but she could feel the heat of his coat against her shoulders, and she could smell him, the clean, cold smell of a man who had been outside all day, the trace of pipe tobacco, the faint sweetness of pine pitch on his hands from the morning's wood splitting. Her heart was beating very hard. She told herself it was the cold. "Now breathe," he said very close to her ear, "all the way out. And while you are breathing out, you squeeze, slow." She breathed. She squeezed. The rifle cracked. The middle tin can leapt off the log and spun into the snow. Adelaide gasped and almost dropped the carbine, and Silas's hand was still over hers, steadying it, and his other hand was still on her elbow, and for one long second, neither of them moved. Then he stepped back. He moved away from her too quickly, the way a man pulls his hand back from a fire he has come too close to. "Good," he said. His voice was rougher than it had been a moment ago. "Reload. Do it yourself this time. I will tell you when you do it wrong." She reloaded. She did not look at him. He did not look at her. She fired the second can off the log a few minutes later, and the third one shortly after that, and when she lowered the rifle, her shoulder ached and her cheeks were burning, and she was not sure whether the burning was from the cold or from the way Silas Whitlock had pulled away so very fast. Walking back to the cabin, neither of them spoke for a long time. The snow crunched beneath their boots. Their breath came out white. Halfway across the dooryard, Silas said, without looking at her, "You did well, Adelaide. Thank you. My mother would have liked you." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. That night, when she was carrying the supper plates back from the table to the wash basin in the kitchen, she passed Silas in the narrow hallway outside the pantry. He was carrying a stack of split kindling in to the kitchen stove. He had to turn sideways to let her pass. She had to turn sideways too. They were close in the way that two people in a narrow hall are always close, and his arm in its rolled flannel sleeve brushed against the wool of her sleeve, and she felt the brief warmth of him. And he kept walking. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. Neither of them looked at Toby, who was standing in the doorway of the front room with his violin in his hand, and who had seen Toby played his violin that evening. He played it after the supper was cleared away, and the dishes were washed, and the fire on the great stone hearth had been built up against the cold of another long night. He played it sitting on the bench by the hearth, his back to the wall, the firelight turning the polished wood of the instrument the color of dark honey. He played a hymn first. Adelaide did not recognize it. He played it slowly, the way a man plays for himself when he is not sure whether anyone is listening. Then he played Annie Laurie. It was her mother's song. It had been her mother's song in life, and after her mother's death it had become a song her father could not bear to hear in the house. Adelaide had not heard the tune played on a violin since she was 12 years old. She was sitting by the window mending the cuff of one of Toby's shirts when the first phrase opened into the room and her hand stilled over the cloth. She did not cry. She did not cry, but something in her chest opened the way a hand opens slowly after it has been clenched for a long time. When the last note faded, Toby looked up at her over the curve of the violin, and he saw her face, and he did not have to ask. "Your mother's song," She nodded. I am sorry, Adelaide. I should have asked first. No, please, do not apologize. It is the first beautiful thing that has happened to me since I left Boston. He smiled, and it was such an open smile, such an undefended smile, that Adelaide felt the familiar small ache in her chest that had been growing all week. The ache of a woman who knows she is being loved by a man she does not know how to love back. Across the room, Ezra sat in the chair by the desk with his account book open in his lap, but he had not turned a page in 5 minutes. He was watching them both. His face was unreadable. When Adelaide glanced at him, he looked down at his book. Silas was not in the room. He had gone out to check the horses an hour ago. He had not come back. The first 3 weeks went by like that. Work and supper, supper and the small fire and the long quiet evenings. Adelaide began to learn the small private kindnesses of the brothers as she would have learned the personalities of 3 difficult patients. Toby brought her a wildflower one morning. He had pulled it from beneath a snowbank, a winter aconite, the first yellow flower of the long thaw, and he had set it in a tin cup of water on the kitchen windowsill where she could see it while she worked. Ezra never said a kind word, but on the morning of the 21st day, when Adelaide came down to make breakfast, she found that the heavy iron skillet, which had always been kept on the high shelf above the stove and which she had never quite been able to reach without standing on a chair, had been moved down to the lower shelf. He had not said anything. He had not asked if it was hard for her. He had simply moved the skillet. Silas brought her things from the woods. He did not bring them to her directly. He left them on the kitchen table where she would find them in the morning. A small handful of dried rose hips in a square of folded cloth with a note in his quick spare hand for tea. Good for the nerves. Once a wing of black grouse feathers, beautifully iridescent, that he must have known a woman with delicate hands might want to set into a hat band or a bookmark. Once a small piece of split oak, shaped like a tiny perfect heart, which she did not believe could be accidental, but he never mentioned it, and she did not ask. She put the heart in the drawer of the bedside table next to her mother's locket, and she did not show it to anyone. On the morning of the 24th day, the bay foal in the corral came up lame. The animal had been born late the previous spring, a colt out of Toby's sorrel mare, and Adelaide had taken to feeding him scraps of apple peeling from her apron pocket on her way back from the hen house each morning. He was a friendly animal. He had a white blaze that ran crooked down his face, and he would push his nose against her shoulder until she laughed. That morning he was holding his right foreleg off the ground, and the leg was swollen below the knee, and when Toby went into the corral to lead him out, the colt cried out in pain and tried to put his head down between his front knees. He has caught a hoof in the stones along the fence, Toby said grimly. He looked over the rails at Ezra, who was standing in the dooryard with his coffee. Ezra, he is favoring it bad. Ezra walked over to the corral. He did not climb in. He looked at the colt for a long minute over the top rail. Get the rifle, Tobias. Ezra, no. Let us at least look at it. He is a young horse. He will not heal a foot in this weather. He will be a cripple by April. Get the rifle. Mr. Whitlock, Adelaide said. She had been standing in the doorway with a pan of dishwater in her hands. She set the pan down on the porch and came out into the dooryard. Mr. Whitlock, will you let me look at his leg? Ezra turned his head slowly and regarded her. This is not a kitten with a thorn in its paw, Miss Thornbury. I know what it is, Mr. Whitlock. My father treated farm animals as often as he treated men in Charlestown. The poor cannot afford a horse doctor and a man doctor both, and so a man doctor learns the horse. Will you let me see the leg before you shoot him? Silas had come out of the barn behind her. He was carrying an armload of hay. He set it down against the corral and walked across the dooryard, and he stopped beside her, and he said quietly to Ezra, Let her look, Ezra. The rifle will still work after dinner. Ezra exhaled through his nose. It was a small sound, but Adelaide heard the surrender in it. He nodded once sharply and stepped back from the corral. Look then. If it is broken, I will not hear another word about it. That is fair, Mr. Whitlock. She went into the cabin and brought out her medical satchel. She brought out a length of clean linen and a tin of axle grease, which was the closest thing she could find to the lubricant she would have used in Boston, and a small folding probe her father had carried in his bag since before she was born. Silas was already in the corral when she came back out. He had a halter on the colt and was speaking to him in a low, steady voice, and the colt was standing more easily than he had been a few minutes before. He trusts you, Adelaide said. He does not know any better. She knelt in the snow beside the foreleg. She did not speak as she worked. She felt the leg with both hands slowly from shoulder to fetlock. She watched the animal's face. When the colt flinched, she made a note. When the colt did not flinch, she made another. She found the heat first. There was a wash of warmth along the inside of the cannon bone just above the fetlock joint, and when she pressed there very gently, the colt threw his head and pawed with his good foot and tried to pull away. Silas held the halter. Silas spoke to the animal. The colt settled. "He has not broken it," she said. "You are sure?" "I am as sure as a person can be without an x-ray, which we do not have. The bone is intact. I can feel it move properly when I bend the joint. He has torn something, I think, a tendon, a ligament. Something has been wrenched and is swelling. If we can get the swelling down and keep him quiet for 3 weeks, I think he will heal. He may always have a knot there. He may always favor it in cold weather, but he will walk. He will work. He will not be a cripple. 3 weeks of rest. In a barn. In a stall. Yes. And what if you are wrong, Adelaide? She looked up at him. Then in 3 weeks, Mr. Whitlock can take his rifle and he can do what he was going to do today. We will lose nothing but 3 weeks of feed and one young horse who is going to die anyway. A silence. Show me what you want to do. She showed him. She had him hold the colt's leg up while she packed it with snow inside a wrapping of clean linen, and she showed him how to make a poultice of the wet linen and the axle grease, which would seal in the cold and slow the swelling. She showed him how to tie the wrapping so that it would not slip, but also would not cut off the blood. She showed him how to tighten and loosen it through the day. She made a brace from 2 short lengths of straight pine that Toby split for her in 5 minutes with the splitting axe, and she lashed them on either side of the lower leg with strips of wet rawhide that would shrink as they dried and hold the brace stiff. She worked for an hour. Ezra Whitlock stood at the corral fence the entire time and did not speak. When she stood up at last and brushed the snow off the front of her wool dress, the colt was standing on 3 legs, but he was standing quietly and his eyes were soft, and when she walked past him to gather her tools, he turned his head and pressed his nose against her shoulder. She was filthy. Her dress was ruined. Her hands were red and chapped from the cold and the snow. She turned to find Silas Whitlock looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. He did not say anything. He nodded once the way Ezra had nodded over the brandy flask the night she arrived. The same nod, from the same family. It meant she understood the same thing. Ezra spoke from the fence. "Miss Thornberry." "Yes, Mr. Whitlock." 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Mr. Whitlock." He turned and walked back toward the cabin. Halfway across the dooryard, he stopped. Without turning around, he said, "Cordelia would have liked that horse." Then he kept walking. It was the 3rd time he had spoken her name in front of Adelaide. Once on the night she arrived, once through the wall on a sleepless night when he had said Cordelia died because of him, and now in plain afternoon sun while walking away from the corral. Adelaide stood in the snow and watched him go. And beside her, Silas Whitlock said very softly so that only she could hear, "He has not spoken her name aloud in 8 years, Adelaide. Not once. Not even at her grave." She did not turn her head. She did not trust her face. She said, "Why now?" "Because of you." That night, after the supper had been cleared and the dishes washed and the men had gone to their separate rooms, Adelaide stayed by the kitchen fire longer than usual. She had told Toby she wanted to mend a tear in her work apron before bed. It was a lie. She wanted to be alone in the front room. She had begun slowly and without admitting it to herself, to read the room. She had read the violin. She had read the empty chair by the desk that no one ever sat in. She had read the small things on the mantelpiece, a pewter cup, a dried sprig of bitter root from a long ago summer, a folded square of pale blue ribbon. She wanted to read the rest of the house. She knew she should not. She did it anyway. She stood up from the bench, set her mending aside, took a single tallow candle from the kitchen, and walked very softly to the back of the front room where a low cabinet sat beneath the side window. The cabinet was made of pine. Its doors had a small iron latch but no lock. She had passed it 40 times in the last 3 weeks. She had never opened it. She opened it now. Inside, there was a stack of 3 books, an old account ledger, a tobacco tin with the lid rusted on, and beneath all of these, lying flat on the cabinet floor, a folded square of newsprint that had yellowed almost to the color of weak tea. She lifted it out. She unfolded it. It was a clipping from the Helena Independent dated November of 1877. The headline made the breath catch in her throat. "Mystery Death in Bitterroot Valley. Mrs. Cordelia Whitlock, 24, found dead at Whitlock Homestead while husband absent. Sheriff closes investigation citing insufficient evidence." She read the article twice. The wife of the late Jeremiah Whitlock's eldest son had been found dead in the bedroom of her own home by her brother-in-law, Mr. Silas Whitlock, late returned from service with the United States Cavalry on the morning of November 14th. She was 8 months pregnant at the time of her death. There were no marks of violence on the body that the visiting territorial physician summoned from Bozeman had been able to identify with certainty. The cause of death was reported as failure of the heart, possibly precipitated by complications of advanced pregnancy and the great cold. Sheriff Albright of Helena had ridden out to the Whitlock claim, conducted what inquiries he could in the depth of winter, and had closed the matter for want of evidence. There was a quote at the bottom of the article. It had been given by Sheriff Albright. This is a lonesome country, the sheriff had said, and a lonesome death. There is nothing in this house that points to any wrong. The good Lord takes whom he will in his season, and the man of the house was 100 miles distant when his Lord called for his wife. Adelaide read the quote 3 times, possibly precipitated by complications of advanced pregnancy, for want of evidence. She felt a coldness move through her chest that had nothing to do with the cabin and everything to do with the article in her hand. She had read enough of her father's medical journals to know what a frontier sheriff in 1877, with no autopsy and no trained eye, could not see on a body. She knew that a great many things could kill a young woman in advanced pregnancy in a cold cabin alone, and that very few of them would leave marks of violence that a tired country lawman would catch. She also knew that a cause of death listed as failure of the heart, possibly precipitated, was not a cause of death at all. It was a confession of ignorance dressed up to look like an answer. Behind her, a board creaked in the doorway. She did not turn around at first. She stood very still with the clipping in her hand, and she heard the steady, measured footstep of a man who had been standing in the dark long enough to have decided what he wanted to say. I told you not to ask about her, Adelaide. It was Silas. She turned slowly. He was standing in the doorway between the front room and the back hall, and he had a single oil lamp in his hand, and the light of the lamp cut his face in half. One side of him she could see. The other side was in shadow. The slate gray eyes were unreadable. I did not ask Silas. You opened the cabinet. Yes. You read it. Yes. Adelaide. He took a single step into the room. She did not move. There are things in this house that you do not want to know yet. Why not? Because once you know them, you will not be able to unknow them. And 90 days is a very long time for a person to live in a house with a thing like that under the floorboards. Silas, the article says the sheriff found nothing because there was nothing he could see. It does not say nothing happened. He did not answer. He came another step closer. He set the lamp down on the cabinet next to her, and the light leapt up the wall and showed her his face fully, and what she saw in his face made her hand tighten on the clipping until the paper crumpled. He looked just for a moment like a man who was about to break. Then he closed his eyes and he gathered himself, and the moment passed. Put it back, Adelaide. Silas, put it back. Tonight, now, and do not open this cabinet again. If you ever ask my brother about Cordelia, he will not tell you. If you ever ask me, I will not tell you. The story does not belong to either of us in a way that we are free to give it. It belongs to her, and it belongs to the man who lost her. And it will be told when he is ready, or it will not be told at all. And if it is never told, then you will have to decide whether you can love a man with a closed door inside him. She stared at him. She wanted suddenly and with surprising violence to reach out and take his face in both of her hands and tell him that she did not want to love the man with the closed door inside him. She wanted to tell him that she wanted to love the man standing in front of her who had warned her on the porch about the dangers of falling in love with a letter, and who had pulled away from her too fast at the rifle range, and who had left a small wooden heart on the kitchen table without ever saying a word about it. She did not. She was a woman of 23, raised in a Methodist house in Boston, and she did not have the words for what she wanted, and she was not even sure yet that what she wanted was a thing a respectable woman was permitted to want. She folded the article carefully along its old creases. She bent down and put it back in the cabinet beneath the account ledger and the tobacco tin and the 3 books in exactly the order she had found it. She closed the doors. She set the iron latch. She straightened up. Silas. Adelaide, I think a great wrong was done in this house 8 years ago. I do not know what it was. I do not know who did it. I do not know whether God has already settled the account or whether it is still waiting to be settled, but I think it was done. And I think the man who lives across this hall from me has been carrying the weight of it alone for 8 winters, and I think it is killing him slower than the cold ever could. Silas said nothing. You do not need to tell me the story, but I am going to tell you something, Silas Whitlock. I came to this house thinking I had come here to be a wife. I am beginning to think I came here to be a healer, not for the colt in the barn, for the man at the head of that supper table, and maybe for one other man besides. She did not say which other man. She did not need to. In the dim oil light by the cabinet, Silas Whitlock's mouth moved as if he were going to speak. He did not. He picked up the lamp, he turned, he walked out of the room, and he did not look back, and Adelaide stood alone in the dark front room of the Whitlock cabin with the dying fire on the hearth and Cordelia's violin gleaming on the wall above it. Outside, a wolf cried in the timber. The first storm of February was riding in across the divide. And in the back of the cabin, in his small, narrow room next to Ezra's, the middle Whitlock brother sat down on the edge of his bed, set the oil lamp on the floor, lowered his face into both of his scarred and calloused hands, and did not move for a long, long time. The fever came on a Tuesday. It came the way the worst things on a mountain always come, which is to say it came quietly and it came from the wrong direction, and by the time anyone in the cabin understood what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. Ezra Whitlock had spent the morning of the 50th day of Adelaide's trial cutting cordwood at the edge of the South Meadow. He had taken his axe and his lunch in a leather pouch, and he had ridden out alone the way he often did, with only his big bay gelding and his Winchester for company. The sun had come up red over the eastern ridge that morning, and the sky had been the color of old copper, and Adelaide had stood in the kitchen door with her coffee in both hands and watched him ride out, and she had felt, without knowing why, a small cold finger of unease trace itself down the length of her spine. Toby had said behind her that the red sky meant a warming. The Chinook was getting ready to push down out of the divide, he had said, and they would have a thaw before the next storm. He had said it cheerfully, the way Toby said most things, and she had let the unease go. She should not have let it go. Ezra came back at dusk. He did not eat his supper. He said the meat tasted strange. He said his head hurt. He sat by the fire for an hour, rubbing the back of his neck the way a man rubs at a wasp sting. And when he stood up to go to bed, he staggered just slightly and caught himself on the back of his chair. Toby had asked quickly if he was all right. Ezra had said just the cold getting into the joints, and he had walked with care to the back of the cabin. Adelaide had heard his door close. She had stood in the kitchen with a dishcloth in her hand, and she had watched the place where he had been, and she had felt the cold finger touch her spine again, and this time she had not let it go. She had gone very quietly to her room. She had taken her father's medical satchel from the foot of the bed, and she had set it open on the table beside the basin. She had laid out in a careful row 3 things: a small clinical thermometer in a cardboard tube, a bottle of distilled spirits with a glass dropper in the cap, a folded square of clean white linen. She had laid them out, and she had sat down on the edge of the bed in her work dress, and she had waited. She had not undressed. She had not slept. By midnight, Ezra was knocking at her door with the back of his hand, and his hand was so weak it hardly made a sound, but Adelaide had been listening, and she was on her feet before the second knock came. She unlatched the door. Ezra Whitlock was standing in the hallway in his nightshirt and his boots. He had not bothered to lace the boots. His hair was wet against his forehead. He was holding the doorframe with both hands as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "Miss Thornberry," he said, "Mr. Whitlock, I do not feel right." His eyes were glassy. His skin was the color of bleached muslin. When she touched the back of her hand to his forehead, the heat radiating off him was so violent that she pulled her hand back without meaning to. She did not waste a single word. "Toby, Silas, now, both of you." She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. The cabin was small. Toby came out of his room in his long johns with his suspenders down and his auburn hair wild, and Silas came out of his room fully dressed the way a man dresses when he has not been sleeping, and one look at Ezra was enough for both of them. "Help me get him to the bed by the fire, the big one in the front room. I cannot work on him in his bedroom. The light is too poor, and I cannot reach him on 3 sides. Toby said, "Adelaide, what is it?" "I do not know yet." "Move him." They moved him. Ezra Whitlock weighed 220 pounds in his stockings, and even with the fever burning him down, he was still a heavy man. The 2 younger brothers carried him between them, one shoulder under each arm, and Adelaide went ahead of them with the lamp, and they laid him down on the wide pine bed in the alcove off the front room, the bed that had belonged to old Jeremiah Whitlock, and where the head of the house was meant to die when his time came. She did not think about that part yet. She built up the fire. She set water on to boil. She rolled up her sleeves. She put the thermometer under his tongue and held his jaw closed until she could read it. She read it twice because she did not believe it the first time. 104.2 degrees Fahrenheit. She felt for the pulse at his throat. The pulse was fast and thin, the way a bird's pulse is fast and thin, and the rhythm was wrong in a small way that she did not like. "Toby, I need you to get me hot water as much as you can, and cold water too. Bring up 2 buckets from the spring house." Silas, I need you to help me get this nightshirt off him to the waist. I need to look at his skin. Silas did not ask why. He took out his belt knife, slit the front of Ezra's nightshirt from collar to waist, and laid it open. Adelaide brought the lamp close. She started at the throat and worked down. She found nothing on the chest but the sheen of fever sweat. She found nothing on the heavy slab of his abdomen. She lifted his right arm, and there on the inside of the wrist, just at the pulse point, she saw them. 3 small, flat pink spots, each no larger than a pinhead. They had not been raised. They had simply seeped into the skin like ink seeping into damp cloth. She lifted his other arm. There were 5 spots on the left wrist. She lifted the hem of his nightshirt and looked at his ankles. There were 6 on the right ankle. There were 8 on the left. She felt her breath go out of her. Petiki, she said half to herself. What? Spots. Bleeding into the skin. Toby, hot water, please. Toby went. She turned to Silas. Silas was standing at the foot of the bed with his arms folded, and his slate gray eyes were on her face. She had not yet said the word she was thinking. That's Silas. Adelaide. This is typhus. A pause. Are you sure? I have seen this presentation 3 times in Charlestown. 3 times. High fever, severe headache, lumbar pain, petechial rash beginning at the extremities. It is the classic camp fever, the tenement fever. It comes from filth. It comes from lice. It comes from crowded sick rooms in summer. I have seen it kill 4 people in a week. Adelaide. I have to break the fever. I have to break it tonight. If his temperature climbs another half a degree, he is going to seize. If he seizes, his heart may stop. I have quinine in my satchel. It is the standard of care for febrile conditions. 5 grains in warm water. It is what every hospital in Boston is using. It is what my father used in the wards. Adelaide. I cannot lose him, Silas. I cannot, not him, not the man at the head of that supper table, not after the colt, not after he spoke her name in the sun. Adelaide, listen to me. Something in his voice stopped her. She actually turned all the way around away from the bed, and she looked at the middle Whitlock brother fully for the first time since the fever had begun. He was very pale. His mouth was a thin line. Adelaide, he said, this is not typhus. She stared at him. Silas, I have seen this exact presentation. You have seen something that looks like this exact presentation. There is another disease in this country that wears the same face, and it does not come from filth, and it does not come from lice, and quinine will not touch it. What? Lift his hair, Adelaide. What? Lift his hair. The hair at the back of his neck. Up at the hairline. She did not understand, but she did it. She lifted Ezra Whitlock's heavy chestnut hair from the back of his neck where it had grown long over the past weeks, and there, half hidden behind his right ear, almost invisible against the fever flush of his skin, was a small black scab. It was no larger than a pea. It had a dry crust at the center and a faint reddened ring around it, as if something had bitten him there, and the bite had partially healed and partially gone bad at the same time. She had not noticed it. She had not thought to look. She looked at Silas. What is this? It is a tick bite, Adelaide. A tick bite. From a brown dog tick or one of its cousins. They live in the timber. They drop on a man from a low pine branch when he is cutting wood, and they crawl up into his hair, and they feed for 2 days, and then they let go and fall off, and he never knows they were there. 2 weeks later, he comes down with this. Silas. This is what they call out here mountain fever. The army surgeons at Fort Boise in 1876 had a longer name for it. They watched 14 men die of it in 2 months. I was a hospital steward there. I held 7 of those soldiers while they died. I know exactly what this is. By Silas. It is not in the medical journals you read in Boston, Adelaide. The Eastern doctors have not written it up yet. They do not believe it exists. They will not call it by a name for another 20 years. But it is real. It is here, and quinine will do nothing for it. Quinine will kill him faster because it will give him cramp and vomiting on top of the fever, and his heart cannot bear that right now. I am asking you, Adelaide Thornberry, trust me on this one thing. Do not give him the quinine. She stood there with the lamp in her hand. She felt her father's voice rise up inside her chest, the voice that had taught her to read the Lancet from the age of 14, the voice that had told her again and again that the future of medicine lay in the laboratory, in the microscope, in the bottle of carbolic acid, in the precise measured dose. She felt her degree, the one she had never been allowed to have, the one she had earned 10 times over in her father's parlor and never been given, rising up in her chest to argue with the man in front of her. And she heard beneath all of that another voice, her father's again, from the last year of his life when he had grown softer and stranger and had begun to say things she had not understood at the time. A doctor, her father had said, who knows everything is no doctor at all. A doctor must always remember the country he is treating. The body is a piece of land, Addie. The disease is a thing that grows on it. The man who has lived all his life on the land knows the names of the weeds that the visiting expert from the city has never seen. She looked at Silas Whitlock. He was a quiet man. He was a damaged man. He had told her almost nothing about himself in 50 days. He had warned her against opening a cabinet she had opened anyway. He had pulled away from her too fast at the rifle range. He had left a small wooden heart on the kitchen table. He was looking at her now with the eyes of a man who had held 7 dying soldiers and knew the difference between camp fever and mountain fever the way some men know the difference between 2 of their own children. She made her decision. She set the small bottle of quinine down on the bedside table without uncorking it. All right, Silas, she said, we do it your way. Tell me what you need. He moved. The change in him when she said yes was the change of a man stepping out of a doorway he had been standing in for hours. He had been waiting for her permission. He had not assumed it. The respect of that, the sheer plain respect of that was something she would carry for the rest of her life. Dried bone set, he said. The bunches hanging from the kitchen rafters in the second row from the door, the leaves where the stem grows straight through the middle. Eupatorium perfoliatum. That is the one. Old Doc Hadley taught me to use it. He was an English physician who came west with the trappers in the 40s. He kept a practice in Boulder for 40 years. He died in my arms of pneumonia in the spring of 1880. He left me his books. He left me his knowledge. He left me bone set for the mountain fever. It works. It is the only thing I have ever seen work. Tell me how. A handful of dried leaves, crumbled, boiling water poured over them, steep 5 minutes, no longer, strain through clean linen. We give it to him hot, half a cup at a time until the fever breaks or until his stomach refuses anymore. The first cup will probably make him vomit. That is good. Whatever poison the body has built up, we want it out. After the vomiting, the second cup. After the second cup, the sweat. After the sweat, the chills. After the chills, the fever breaks. If it works. And if it does not, then we have lost nothing, Adelaide. The quinine would not have saved him. She nodded. She moved to the rafters. She found the bunches. She crumbled the dried leaves between her hands the way a chemist crumbles a sample, and she breathed in the bitter, green, dusty smell of the herb, and it smelled like every old wisdom she had ever scoffed at in her father's parlor, and she did not scoff at it now. She measured the leaves into a clean tin cup by eye, the way Silas had told her, the way her father had taught her she should never measure anything. She poured the boiling water. She watched her own hands. They did not shake. 5 minutes by her father's silver pocket watch, she strained the dark greenish-brown liquid through a folded square of surgical gauze into a fresh cup. She carried the cup to the bedside. Toby had come back with the water. He was standing in the doorway of the front room with a bucket in each hand, and he had been standing there for some minutes, and his face was very pale. Adelaide, what can I do? Hold his head, Toby. Hold it gently. Tilt it back. We are going to give him this whether he wants it or not. She knelt beside the bed. She slid one hand under Ezra's neck and lifted his head against her shoulder, and his hair was wet, and his skin was so hot it felt like the side of a stove. Ezra, she said very close to his ear. Ezra Whitlock, you drink this. Do you hear me? You drink this for Cordelia, and for your brothers, and for me. You drink this because I am a doctor's daughter, and I am telling you to. Open your mouth. His eyes did not open, but his mouth did. She tipped the cup. The bitter dark liquid ran between his lips. He coughed. A little ran down into his beard. She tilted his head a little further. She used the thumb of her free hand to depress his jaw, the way she had been taught with diphtheria patients in the wards, gently just at the corner. She rubbed his throat with 2 fingers, the way her father had shown her to trigger the swallow reflex. He swallowed. He swallowed once. He swallowed twice. He drank the cup. She lowered him down. She sat back on her heels. Behind her, Silas Whitlock said quietly, "Now we wait." For the next 20 minutes, she did not move from the side of the bed. She held Ezra's wrist with 2 fingers on his pulse, and she counted the beats, and she watched the small clock on the mantel above the hearth. His breathing changed first. It became deeper, then it caught again, then his back arched off the bed, and he turned his head, and Adelaide had time only to grab the pewter wash basin off the floor and bring it under his face before he retched. He brought up bile. He brought up something black. He brought up something that smelled like old iron and wrong meat. Adelaide held the basin and held his head and did not flinch. "Good," she heard Silas say behind her. Good, Ezra. Get it all out. When he was finished, he fell back against the pillow. His breathing eased. Then the sweat broke. It did not break the way fever sweat usually breaks, slowly in a sheen across the brow. It broke like a dam. Within 5 minutes, the front of his nightshirt was soaked through. His hair was running. The pillow beneath his head darkened. The smell of him in the cabin changed from the dry copper smell of fever to something like wet wool and sage. Adelaide pulled the wet sheet off him. She put a dry one under him. She wiped his forehead and his throat and his chest with a cloth wrung out of cool water. She kept her hand on his pulse. The pulse was slowing. The wild thin bird beat was easing into something steadier. Then the chills came. He began to shake, not a tremor, a bone shake, the kind of full-body shake that rattles the teeth in the head. Adelaide piled the heavy quilts back over him. She added her own wool shawl. She added Toby's coat from the peg by the door. She added the buffalo robe from the bench by the hearth. The shaking did not stop. His teeth were chattering. His lips were going blue. Adelaide, Toby said, Adelaide, he is going to lose all his heat in the wet. He needs... I know, she knew. She knew what the book said about hypothermia. She knew what Dr. Lister and Dr. Curry and the great cold water cure men of the Eastern colleges said. She knew what the Army manual said and what the Lancet said and what her father's marginal notes in Gray's Anatomy said. They all said the same thing. She knew what she had to do. She turned to the two younger brothers. She did not let her voice catch. Toby, Silas, both of you, out of this room, now. Adelaide, Toby, out. Close the door behind you. I will call you when I need you. Go. They went. The door closed. She was alone in the front room with the burning fire and the dying brother of the man she did not yet know she loved. She did what had to be done. She did it in the dim red light of the hearth, and she did it with the practical, brisk efficiency of a woman who had been raised in a doctor's house and who had bathed the bodies of three sisters dying of consumption when she was 16 years old. She got the wet things off him. She got dry things on him. She layered him in dry wool and dry blankets and the heavy buffalo robe. She moved him onto a fresh, dry pillow. And then she did the last thing the book said to do. When a man's body has lost the will to make its own heat, and the only heat in the room is going to have to come from another body. She climbed up onto the wide pine bed beside him on top of the blankets fully dressed, and she pressed her back against his back through the layers of wool, and she pulled the buffalo robe up over both of them, and she lay there in the dark with her hand on his shaking shoulder. She lay there for an hour. The shaking eased, his breath deepened, the fever was breaking. Outside, the wind, which had been rising for hours, dropped. It dropped suddenly the way the wind drops in the high country when the Chinook arrives. A warm breath came down the chimney and stirred the embers on the hearth. Somewhere far down the valley, a great mass of snow loosed itself off a roof and slid to the ground with a long, muffled rumble. Spring was coming. Not today, not tomorrow, but it was coming. Adelaide closed her eyes. She did not know it then, but she had just saved the life of Ezra Whitlock. She had also, in the same act, just made certain of the second thing she would need to know before this winter ended. She was no longer a guest in this house. Ezra came back to himself before dawn. She felt him stir against her back. She felt his breathing change. She felt the heat of him no longer the wild, burning heat of the fever, but the ordinary deep heat of a sleeping man settle into a steady human warmth. She slid carefully off the bed. She tucked the buffalo robe up under his chin. She built up the fire on the hearth. She went to the door and opened it. Toby and Silas were sitting on the bench in the hallway. They had not moved in an hour. Toby's eyes were red. Silas's were not red, but they were ringed in the way a man's eyes are ringed when he has been awake too long for too many years. "He is sleeping," she said. "The fever is broken. He will live." Toby made a sound she had never heard a grown man make. It was the small, private sound of a younger brother who has been afraid for too long and now does not have to be afraid anymore. He put his face in his hands. Silas did not say anything for a long moment. Then he stood up. He crossed the few steps between them, and he did not touch her, but he stopped within arm's length, and he looked down into her face, and what was in his slate gray eyes she did not have a name for. "Adelaide." "Silas, thank you." It was all he said. She nodded. She went past him down the hall into her own small room, and she closed the door, and she sat on the edge of the bed in her wool dress that smelled of sweat and fire and bear grease and another man's fever, and she put her hands over her face, and she cried for 10 minutes straight without making a sound. Then she washed her face, she changed her dress, she came back out, she made breakfast. That was the morning the Chinook came down off the divide, and the bitter winter began slowly to give back the country it had taken. By noon, the icicles along the eaves were dripping. By the next afternoon, the trail to Trading Post Junction was passable for a man on horseback if he picked his way carefully and if he was strong and if his business was important enough to be worth the ride. And On the afternoon of the second day, after Ezra Whitlock had nearly died of the mountain fever while Adelaide was hanging wet sheets on the line behind the cabin and the warm wind was lifting the loose hair at the back of her neck, the dogs in the barn began to bark. A rider was coming up the south trail. He was alone. He was leading a second horse on a long lead behind him. He was a stranger. Silas, who had been splitting kindling at the wood pile, set down the axe and walked across the dooryard to the rail where his Winchester leaned against the fence post. He picked it up. He worked the lever once. He did not raise it. He waited. The rider came up out of the timber and into the dooryard, and he reined in 20 yards short of the cabin. He was a thin man. He had a long face and a long jaw and a black hat pulled low over his eyes. He wore a heavy oilskin coat and a holstered revolver on a belt that had been worked black with use. Across his saddle, casual as a walking stick, lay a Sharps rifle. He looked at Silas. Silas looked at him. The stranger smiled. He had a smile like a man who has been waiting for a very long time to walk into a particular dooryard and is now at last pleased to be there. Silas Whitlock, he said. His voice was soft. Mister. You do not know me, but you knew my father. Silas's face did not move. I do not believe I had that pleasure. You had it. You had it on a November morning 8 years ago in a hotel room in Helena. You and your brother Ezra, you and my father. The four of us were not all in the room at the same time, of course. My father was alone with the two of you, and he did not walk out. The stranger smiled again. My name is Jasper Mordecai. My father was Colonel Hiram Mordecai of the 7th Cavalry. Perhaps that name is a little more familiar. Silas Whitlock did not move, but Adelaide, watching from the laundry line with a wet sheet in her hands and her heart beginning to pound, saw the long, slow change come over the back of his shoulders. It was the change of a man settling into a position he had been preparing for in the back of his mind for 8 years. Mr. Mordecai, Silas said, I have come a long way to meet you, Mr. Whitlock. I expect we will have much to talk about. I expect we will. Will you offer a traveler the hospitality of your fire? I will offer you a chair on my porch and a cup of coffee, Mr. Mordecai. We will see about the fire after we have spoken. Jasper Mordecai laughed. It was a soft, dry laugh, the laugh of a man who had nowhere in particular to be and all the time in the world to be there. That will do me fine, Mr. Whitlock, he said. That will do me just fine. He swung down from his horse. He did not put up his rifle. He left it across the saddle where his right hand could reach it without bending. And on the porch behind Adelaide, the door of the cabin opened, and Ezra Whitlock came out into the warm Chinook afternoon for the first time in 3 days, and he stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves with one hand braced against the jamb, and he looked across the dooryard at the stranger. His face went the color of bone. Adelaide, he said quietly without turning his head. Yes, Ezra. Take your laundry inside the house. Take it inside now and bolt the back door behind you. She did not ask why. She gathered the wet sheets in her arms and she walked very calmly around the corner of the cabin to the back porch. She stepped inside. She set the basket down. She bolted the back door. She went to the front window. She drew the curtain back 2 inches and looked out. In the dooryard, 3 men were standing in a triangle, Silas with the Winchester in his hands, Ezra in the doorway behind him, Jasper Mordecai 20 yards out by the head of his horse, smiling with his right hand resting easily on the butt of his Sharps rifle. Behind her on the bed by the hearth, Toby came up from where he had been kneeling at his elder brother's bedside. He saw the look on her face. He came to the window. He looked out. He said one word, Mordecai. She turned. Toby, who is he? He is the son of the man Silas and Ezra killed in 1877. Toby, in the week after they buried Cordelia Adelaide, they rode straight from her grave to Helena. The Chinook wind blew warm across the dooryard. The first storm of the new season was 8 hours away, climbing the back of the divide, and the truth that had been sleeping in this cabin for 8 winters was about to come out into the light at last. Adelaide stood at the window with her hand on the curtain, and she could not look away. Toby spoke at her shoulder, low and fast, telling her in pieces what he had never been allowed to tell her in whole. Cordelia knew something, Adelaide. That is all I was ever told. She knew something about Colonel Mordecai. The colonel had been running guns out of the army post at Fort Shaw that summer, selling repeating rifles to men he should not have been selling them to. He used the freight road that came through our valley. He stopped at this cabin once when Ezra was away to water his horses. Cordelia gave him coffee. She heard a thing she should not have heard. She wrote a letter to Ezra in Bozeman warning him. The letter was carried by a freighter. The freighter drank in the wrong saloon. The colonel found out. Ezra was 3 days from home when the colonel rode up the South Trail. Silas had come back from the army a week before. He was sleeping in the barn that day because he could not stand to be inside walls yet. He heard Cordelia scream. He came running. He was too late. The colonel was already gone. Adelaide pressed her forehead against the cold window glass. What did Silas do? He buried her. He held her body until Ezra got home 2 days later, and then they rode together to Helena. They tracked the colonel to a hotel. They went up the back stairs. They did not come back down with him. Did the law. Silas walked into the federal marshal's office the next morning and told him exactly what they had done. He laid the evidence of the gun running on the marshal's desk, the letters and the receipts and the names. There was a hearing. There was no trial. The army was glad to be rid of the matter quietly. They dropped Silas from the rolls without honor. They never charged either brother with the killing. The papers called it a hotel fire. That is the story you read in the clipping. The cause of death listed for Cordelia was the cause of death the army needed listed. It was never the truth. And the colonel had a son. He had a son. The son was 16. He was at school in St. Louis. We never thought he would come. 8 years. A man like that does not forget Adelaide. He waits until he is grown. He waits until he has money and friends and time, and then he comes. In the dooryard, Jasper Mordecai had taken his cup of coffee. He was sitting on the porch bench, the Sharps rifle across his knees, sipping the coffee as if he had stopped at a friend's house on a summer afternoon. Silas stood 5 feet away from him, the Winchester in the crook of his arm. Ezra stood in the doorway with one hand still braced against the jamb. None of them was looking at any of the others directly. All three were watching the line of the timber. Adelaide understood watching them that this would not be settled today. A man like Jasper Mordecai had come to look. He had come to count. He had come to see how many guns were in the house and where the stable was and where the back door opened and how the light fell on the dooryard at different hours of the day. He had not come to be killed in the open at noon. He had come to plan. He drank his coffee. He stood up. He set the cup down on the porch rail. "Much obliged, Mr. Whitlock," he said to Ezra. "I expect I will be in this country sometime. I have a claim down by the Yellowstone I mean to look in on, and a few other small businesses about the territory. I trust we will see one another again." "I trust we will, Mr. Mordecai." "Give my regards to your wife." There was a pause. The mountain held its breath. "I have no wife, Mr. Mordecai." Jasper Mordecai smiled. "My mistake. I thought I saw a woman at the laundry line." He touched the brim of his hat. He mounted his horse. He rode out of the dooryard without hurry, as if he were leaving a country store, and the dogs in the barn watched him go, and they did not start barking again until he was a quarter of a mile down the trail, which Adelaide later learned was the way trained dogs behave around a man who has hunted them. The minute he was gone, Ezra turned from the doorway, came inside, and bolted the front door behind him. He looked at his brothers. He looked at Adelaide. He said, "Sit down, all three of you. We have a great deal to talk about, and we have until sundown to talk about it." That night was the longest night of Adelaide Thornbury's life, and it was also the night that everything in her chest that had been waiting to break finally broke. They sat at the long pine table for 4 hours. Ezra told her what Toby had told her at the window, but he told it slowly in his own voice with the long pauses and the dry, steady cadence of a man laying down a confession he had been building inside himself for almost a decade. He did not weep. He did not raise his voice. He spoke about Cordelia the way a man speaks about a country he has not visited in a long time, and he spoke about the killing of the colonel the way a man speaks about a debt he had paid in full and would pay again exactly the same way if the same morning ever came again. When he was finished, he reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and laid something on the table between them. It was a small leather book. The cover was worn. The corners were soft. There was a faint dark stain on the front board in the shape of a thumb. "This was hers," he said. "I have not opened it in 8 years. Silas brought it to me the day after the burial. I could not. I do not have the right to open it now alone. Adelaide, you will read it with me. Tonight, please." She put her hand on the book, and the book was warm, the way old leather grows warm in a closed pocket against a man's heart, and she understood that she was being given a thing that had been carried untouched for a decade. They opened it together. Cordelia Whitlock had written in a fine schoolmistress hand, sloping a little the ink, fading in places where the cabin damp had touched the page. The early pages were ordinary. Recipes, lists of seed for the garden, a page about the first time she had seen the bitterroot bloom, a page about the way Ezra had laughed the year they were married when she had tried to teach him to dance, a page about the baby she was carrying and the names she was thinking of, 2 names if it was a boy and 3 if it was a girl. Adelaide read those pages through her tears, and Ezra read them with his face turned toward the fire, and neither of them spoke. The last entries were different. The handwriting was tighter, the ink was darker, the phrases were short. Colonel M came again today, watered horses, made an excuse to come into the kitchen, asked too many questions about the road north. about the freighters, about when E was due home. I do not like the way this man looks at me. I have written to E in Bozeman. I have told him what I overheard last week between the colonel and his sergeant in the smokehouse when they did not know I was inside, about the rifles, about the price the colonel is asking and who is paying it and where the wagons go. I have told E that he must not return alone. He must come with the law, I am afraid. If anything happens to me before E comes home, I want him to know this. It is not his fault. He has been a good husband to me. He has been the best husband a country woman could pray for. And if he reads this when I am gone, I want him to know one thing more. Ezra, my love, the colonel will come back. I do not think I will live the week. He is the kind of man who closes mouths. I have closed mine to keep yours alive, and that is enough. Do not break yourself on this. Do not. I have loved you every day of these 3 years more than the woman I was before I met you ever knew how to love a man. I am not sorry for any minute of it, not even this last one. And one more thing. Silas has been in this house for 10 days. I have seen him watching me, and he does not know I have seen him, and I want it written somewhere that I am not blind. He is a good man. He has carried himself like a saint. He has not so much as touched my hand. Whatever winter that boy is walking through, I forgive him for it before he asks. When I am gone, tell him that. Tell him to love again. Tell him not to let my grave stand between him and any woman God might send to this mountain after me. I am tired now. I am going to lie down for a while. If E reads this, kiss the baby for me. He should have been a fine boy. We were going to call him Nathaniel after your father's grandfather. Yours always and only, Cordelia. Adelaide closed the book. Ezra Whitlock had gone the color of wax. He was sitting bolt upright in his chair with both hands flat on the table, and he was breathing shallowly the way a man breathes when he is trying not to let any sound come up out of him. She slid her hand across the table. She covered his hand with her own. She did not speak. He turned his hand over beneath hers, and he gripped her fingers, and he gripped them until her knuckles ached, and she did not pull away. After a long time, he said very quietly, 8 years. Yes. She forgave me. Before she died, she forgave me. Yes. I did not deserve that. Ezra Whitlock, listen to me. There is no person in this world who deserves the forgiveness of the people they have loved. We are all given that when we are given it as a free gift. You were given a gift tonight. Take it. Take it the way you would take a horse pulled out of a frozen river. Take it because it is yours. Take it because she gave it to you. He bent his head. He did not weep. He had not learned how in 8 years. But something inside him broke and went still at the same time, and Adelaide felt it through the table, through his hand, through the whole long room of the cabin, and she understood that the man who would walk out of that chair in the morning was not going to be the man who had sat down in it. After a while, Ezra raised his head. He looked at his middle brother, who had been sitting very quietly on the bench by the hearth the whole time, and whose face had been turned away from them both for most of the reading. Silas, Ezra, did you hear what she wrote about you? I heard. Then you heard your sister's last command. Silas did not answer. Ezra stood up. He picked up the book. He carried it to the mantelpiece and set it there beside the dried sprig of bitter root, and he turned around and he looked at Adelaide, and then he looked at Silas, and then he looked at Adelaide again. Miss Thornberry, the trial is over. Mr. Whitlock, it is over. Tonight, you have saved my life with your hands, and you have saved my soul with that book. There are no more 90 days. There is no return ticket to Boston. You belong in this house, and you belong in it on whatever terms you choose. Tobias has loved you in his way, and you are kind to him, and he is a good man, and he will be a good man whether or not you marry him. Silas has loved you in his way also longer than I have known, and longer than he has admitted, and he will go on loving you whether or not you ever say a word back to him. You are free in this house, Adelaide Thornberry. You are free to choose. Do you hear me? I hear you, Ezra. Good. Now I am going to my bed. I have not slept in 3 nights. Tobias will sit up until the sun comes round. Silas, you will walk this woman out onto the porch because she is going to ask you a question, and I would rather not be in the room when she asks it. He did not wait for any of them to answer. He picked up the lamp. He walked down the hall. His door closed. She stood up from the table. Her legs felt very strange. She walked to the door. She opened it. She stepped out onto the porch. Silas followed her. The night had cleared. The Chinook had blown the storm clouds off the divide, and the sky over the Bitterroot Range was crowded with stars, more stars than Adelaide had ever seen in 23 years of looking up at the sky over Boston. The snow in the dooryard was crusted from the day's thaw and the night's freeze. It glittered like crushed glass. Silas stood in the doorway behind her. She did not turn around. She said, "You told me on this porch 50 days ago that you had watched your brother fall in love with a stranger once before and you would not see another woman buried on this mountain." I remember. You did not tell me that night the other reason you were warning me. No. You told me you did not deserve to be loved. I did not say it like that. You said it like that, Silas. You said you did not deserve any woman. You said you carried too much darkness. Cordelia wrote it in her book in plain English 8 years ago. She saw you watching her. She knew what you felt. She forgave you for it before you ever even named it to yourself. She told her husband to tell you when she was gone to love again. He did not speak. She turned around then. He was a tall, dark shape against the open doorway, lit only by the embers of the kitchen fire behind him, and she could not see his face clearly. She did not need to. Silas Whitlock, she said, I came to this house thinking I was going to marry your brother. I have known for many weeks that I am not. Your brother is a good man and a kind man and a man I will love every day of my life as a brother, but I do not love him as a wife loves a husband. I love you. I have loved you since the night you sat on this porch and warned me to be careful. I have loved you since the morning you held my hand on the rifle stock and stepped back from me too fast. I have loved you since the day you put a small wooden heart on the kitchen table and walked away without saying a word. And I am tired of waiting for you to give yourself permission, so I am giving it to you here in front of God and the stars. I am giving you permission, Silas. Take it. He did not move for a long moment. When he did move, he came across the porch in 2 long strides, and he stopped in front of her, and he stood looking down into her face, and his slate gray eyes in the starlight were not tired anymore. Adelaide. Yes. I have nothing to give you. I have a small cabin and a damaged name and bad dreams that come most nights and the bones of a woman buried at the south end of this meadow. I'm not afraid of any of those things. I am 31 years old. I have no money of my own. I have no future, I can promise you. I am 23 years old. I have no money. I have no family. I have no future anyone has promised me. We are even. Adelaide. Silas, stop. Tell me you love me. That is all you have to say. The rest we can build. He breathed out. He raised his hand. He laid it against the side of her face very slowly, the way a man approaches an animal he has been hoping for years would come to him on its own. I love you, Adelaide Mary Thornberry. God help me, I have loved you since the hour you stepped down off that horse with my brother's coat around your shoulders. I will love you until they put me in the ground, and I will love you for whatever comes after that, if there is anything after that. She closed her eyes. She turned her face into his hand. A man keeps his word in Bitterroot, she thought. Her father had always said that about the few good men he knew. A man keeps his word. He bent his head down toward hers. In the doorway behind them, no one was watching. Toby Whitlock, who had been watching from the hearth, had stood up very quietly when he saw his brother and the woman he had once thought he would marry step out onto the porch together. He had walked into the kitchen, he had picked up his violin, he had carried it up to the loft, and he had sat down on the edge of the loft bed, and he had laid the violin across his knees, and he had not played it, he had only held it. After a while in the dark, he had said softly to himself, Cordelia would have liked her. And then he had wiped his face on the cuff of his shirt and he had gone to sleep. 2 days later, while Adelaide was in the hen house and Ezra was on the porch cleaning his rifle, Jasper Mordecai came back up the south trail. He was not alone this time. He had 3 men with him. They came at first light riding hard, and the dogs in the barn began to bark a full minute before the riders cleared the timber, and that minute was the difference between a slaughter and a fight. Ezra was on his feet at the first bark. Silas was already in the dooryard coming back from the woodpile, and he saw the 4 shapes coming up out of the trees, and he ran for the cabin door without breaking stride, calling Toby's name. Toby was in the loft. He came down the ladder with his rifle in one hand and his cartridge belt in the other. Adelaide came running from the hen house with eggs spilling from her apron. Inside, Silas said. Adelaide, inside the house, now. There is a Sharp's carbine on the pegs by the back door. It is loaded. Get behind the table. If anyone comes through that back window, you fire. She did not waste a word. She went. The 4 riders reined in 50 yards out by the corral. They stayed mounted. Jasper Mordecai sat on the lead horse with the same easy smile on his long face. The other 3 were younger and harder. They wore long oilcloth dusters, and their hands were on their pistols, and they did not speak. Mr. Whitlock, Jasper called, I have come to settle our small account. Ezra stood in the doorway with his rifle. You have come to die on my porch, Mordecai. Ride out. I do not believe I will. Then we have nothing more to say. Jasper raised his sharps and fired. The bullet took a chunk out of the door frame 2 inches above Ezra's head. Ezra did not flinch. He returned fire from the hip, levering the Winchester one-handed, and one of Jasper's men jerked sideways in the saddle and slid down the wrong side of his horse and did not get up. Then everything happened at once. Silas was at the front window with his rifle, and he shot the man on the right out of the saddle clean. Toby was at the back of the cabin, firing through the kitchen window at the 3rd man who had circled to come at the back door. Adelaide was crouched behind the table with the small sharp's carbine in her hands, and she was watching the back window, and her hands were not shaking. Jasper Mordecai broke from his cover behind the corral and came running across the dooryard with his pistol out. He was running for the porch. He was running for Ezra. He was running with his face set in the long, hungry look of a man who had waited 8 years for one specific shot and meant to take it now. He fired, he missed, he fired again, he missed. He was 20 feet from the porch when Toby Whitlock came out the front door at a dead sprint and put himself directly between his elder brother and Jasper Mordecai's third bullet. The bullet took Toby in the chest just below the right collarbone. He turned slowly with a look of mild surprise on his open, boyish face, and he looked at Ezra and he said perfectly clearly, "There you are." And he sat down on the porch boards as if his legs had simply given up. Ezra Whitlock stepped over his brother and shot Jasper Mordecai twice in the chest at 15 feet. Jasper went down in the snow. Behind the cabin, Toby's third man fired one last wild shot through the kitchen window, and then he turned his horse and ran. Silas was already out the front door at a sprint going for his own horse. He swung up bareback in one motion and went after the running man in a long, graceful gallop across the meadow. Adelaide came out of the cabin with her hands shaking now finally, but with her mind clear. She knelt on the porch boards beside Toby Whitlock. Toby, look at me. Stay with me. Adelaide, do not talk. I am going to lift your shirt. Ezra, hot water fast. Bring the satchel from the bedroom. Bring everything. The wound was bad. The bullet had gone in clean below the collarbone and had not come out. It had clipped the top of the lung. Toby was already coughing pink froth. Adelaide had seen this kind of wound twice before in Charlestown in men who had been shot in tavern fights, and one of them had lived and one of them had died. She did not let herself think about which one. She got him onto the kitchen table. She washed her hands in the basin with her father's bottle of carbolic acid. She washed Toby's chest. She probed for the bullet with her father's long forceps working by lamplight in the cold front room, with Ezra holding his younger brother down by the shoulders, and Silas returned from the meadow holding the lamp steady at the proper angle. Toby had passed out from the pain after the first probe, which she was grateful for. She found the bullet against the back of the third rib. She brought it out clean. She washed the wound again. She closed it with the silk thread she had been carrying in her satchel for 400 miles. She listened to the lung with her father's stethoscope. The collapse was small. The bleed was stopping. He would live. If the wound did not turn septic, he would live. She straightened up. Her dress was soaked with blood from the chest down. Her hands were red to the wrists. She looked at Ezra and she looked at Silas, and she said very simply, "He will live. We will know for sure in 3 days, but I think he will live." Ezra Whitlock walked out of the cabin without a word. He walked across the dooryard, past the body of Jasper Mordecai in the snow, and he kept walking until he reached the line of the timber, and there, where the brothers could not see him, he put his face against the rough bark of an old pine, and he stayed there for a long time. He did not weep even then. But the ice that had held inside him for 8 years, the ice, Cordelia's letter had cracked and Adelaide's hands had warmed, finally at long last broke and ran out of him into the snow. He came back inside an hour later. He did not say a word. He sat down on the floor beside the bed where Toby was sleeping, and he put one big calloused hand on his youngest brother's forehead, and he kept it there until morning. Toby Whitlock woke on the morning of the third day after he had been shot, and the first thing he saw was Adelaide asleep in the chair beside his bed, her honey-colored hair come loose from its braid, her hand still resting on his wrist where she had been counting his pulse. He smiled. He whispered, "You look like the wrong picture I painted of you." She woke instantly. "Toby, I am all right, Adelaide. I am here." She put her face down into the blanket beside his hand, and she let herself cry finally the way she had not let herself cry in 3 days. When she lifted her head, Toby had turned his head on the pillow so he could see her. "Adelaide, where is Silas?" "In the barn, splitting wood. He has not slept either." "Send him to me." She went. When Silas came to the bedside, Toby waited until the door was closed behind him. "Silas, sit down." He sat. "Brother, I need to say a thing to you, and I do not have the breath for many words, so listen the first time." "Toby, I have known for a long time. I have known since the rifle range. I have known since the night you put the wooden heart on the kitchen table. I am not a stupid man, Silas. I am a young man, and I am sometimes a foolish man, but I am not a stupid man. I wrote her letters, and I fell in love with the letters. She came west, and she fell in love with you. That is the story, brother. That is the whole story. There is no more to it. Toby, I will not." You will. You will because I am telling you to. You will because Cordelia told Ezra to in her book, and now I am telling you to here. You will marry her, Silas. You will marry her in the spring. You will love her every day of your life the way I would have tried to, and the way you will do better than I would have. And you will name your first daughter for our mother, and you will name your second daughter Cordelia, and we will let no woman in this family ever again be forgotten by the men who loved her. Do you hear me, brother? Silas had bowed his head. He could not speak for a long moment. When he could, he said only, I hear you. Good. Now go. Bring her back in. I am not finished with her either. When Adelaide came back to the bedside, Toby took her hand in his good one. Adelaide, I have only one thing to ask of you. Anything, Toby. Will you let me play your wedding? She bent down and she kissed him on the forehead. It was the only kiss she had ever given him, and it was the only kiss she would ever give him. Yes, Toby. Yes. Of all the people in this world, you are the one who must play it. The bitterroot bloomed white in the meadows in the third week of May, 1886, and on the first Sunday after the bloom, Adelaide Mary Thornberry married Silas Whitlock at the little wooden church at Bitterroot Junction. The Reverend Joshua Penrose, who had ridden up from Helena for the occasion, and who had not seen a wedding on this stretch of the territory since before the Mordecai business, performed the ceremony in his old, long black coat. Mrs. Prudence Galloway sat in the front pew on the bride's side and wept openly through the entire service the way she had told Adelaide during the long stagecoach ride the autumn before, that she would weep at any wedding she got to attend before she died. Old Doc Hadley was not in the church. He had been dead 6 years. But Silas had carried his old physician's bag down off the mountain that morning, and he had set it on the front pew in the empty seat beside Mrs. Galloway. And Adelaide had understood, without being told, that this was how a man who had outlived his teacher made his teacher come to the wedding. Ezra Whitlock walked Adelaide down the short aisle. He had asked her 3 nights before by the kitchen fire whether she would let him do it. He had said very quietly that her father was not here to do it, and her father had given him this woman to keep alive on a mountain, and a man did not give away another man's daughter without standing up in front of God to do it. He had said it with his eyes on the floor, and Adelaide had taken his hand in both of hers, and she had said, yes, of course, who else? When they reached the altar, Ezra placed her hand in the hand of his middle brother, and then he stepped back and stood at his brother's right shoulder, and he said in a voice that carried clear to the back pew, I give this woman who is my sister already to my brother who is the better part of me. May God keep them both. The Reverend Penrose asked the questions. Silas Whitlock answered them in the steady voice of a man who had been waiting most of his life to answer them. I do until death and after that as well. When the Reverend pronounced them and Silas had bent his head and given Adelaide the second kiss of her life, and the small congregation had risen from the pews, Toby Whitlock came down the aisle from where he had been standing near the back, his right arm still strapped close against his chest, the violin tucked carefully into the crook of his good left arm. He did not play Annie Laurie. He played a tune he had been working on in private in the loft since the night he had heard his brother step out onto the porch with the woman he had once thought he would marry. He had not given the tune a name yet. He played it slowly with his left hand on the bow because his right shoulder was still weak, and the melody was something between Annie Laurie and a Scotch reel and the long, high keening of a bitterroot wind, and there was not a person in the small church who did not weep before he was done. When he lowered the violin, Adelaide came down off the altar and crossed to where he stood, and she took his good hand in both of hers, and she said in front of God and the congregation and the brothers and the old preacher, what is this song called, Toby? It does not have a name, Adelaide. It has one now. Call it Adelaide's Spring. He smiled. He nodded. He did not trust himself to speak. A man keeps his word. In Bitterroot, Toby Whitlock had kept his. The first year on the Whitlock homestead after the wedding, Silas and Adelaide hung a small wooden sign over the door of the spring house, which they had cleaned out and whitewashed and turned into a small frontier surgery. The sign had been carved by Toby in the long evenings of his recovery. It said in plain block letters, Whitlock Valley Medical Post. Below it in smaller letters, S. Whitlock and A. Whitlock. No man or animal turned away. By autumn, they had treated 47 patients. A man with a broken leg from a fallen pine, a woman in difficult labor on a homestead 12 miles up the South Fork whose baby Adelaide brought into the world at 3 a.m. by the light of a single oil lamp, a boy bitten by a rattlesnake, a horse gone lame that no one else had thought worth saving, an old prospector with pneumonia who Adelaide and Silas nursed back from the edge over 6 long nights working in shifts, the way her father had told her good doctors did when they had each other and good doctors did not when they did not. The Chinook came again the next spring. The bitterroot bloomed white again. And in the late summer of 1887, on a clear, warm morning, Adelaide laid a small, dark-haired son in her husband's arms for the first time. And Silas Whitlock, who had been a hospital steward and a soldier and a brother to a woman buried at the south end of the meadow, sat down on the edge of the bed with his son against his chest and could not speak for a long time. They named the boy Nathaniel for her father, for the boy Cordelia had wanted to call Nathaniel and had never gotten to. 2 years later, in the early winter of 1889, a daughter came. They named her Cordelia the way Toby had asked them to that night in the sick room. She had Silas's slate gray eyes and Adelaide's honey-colored hair, and Ezra Whitlock, who held her on the day she was christened, looked down into the small face of his niece and finally, after 12 years, wept openly in front of his family. Toby Whitlock courted a quiet young school teacher who had come up from Vermont to teach the small school at Bitterroot Junction. Her name was Eleanor Whitfield. She was 25. She read Dickens in the evenings and could not bake bread to save her life, and Toby loved her without reservation, and they were married in the spring of 1888 at the same little church where Adelaide and Silas had been married. Toby played his own wedding with his good arm finally fully recovered, and his bride wept all the way through the ceremony, and Adelaide stood in the front pew holding Nathaniel and remembered the night Toby had played Annie Laurie by the fire and she had not been able to cry. She cried now. She cried for happiness and for relief and for the boy who had once written letters east in search of a wife and had ended up finding the right one the long way around in the schoolhouse, not 3 miles from the cabin where he had been born. In 1891, Ezra Whitlock himself, after 14 years a widower, met a soft-spoken woman named Annabelle Carruthers at a livestock auction in Helena. She was 32 and a widow with a quiet 10-year-old boy of her own. Ezra rode home from that auction the next morning, 4 hours behind his brothers, and he did not speak about the woman to anyone, and Adelaide had to wait until June of the next year before he came in from a long ride and stood in her kitchen door and said with great difficulty and much embarrassment, "Adelaide, I have been thinking about Mrs. Carruthers." She set down the bowl she had been holding, and she came to him, and she put her hand on his arm. "Then you ought to bring Mrs. Carruthers to dinner, Ezra Whitlock." He brought her. They were married at Easter of 1892. The boy, whose name was Henry, came running into Ezra's arms at the wedding feast as if he had always been waiting for a father like this, which in the way that mattered he had been. By the year 1900, Nathaniel Whitlock was 13 years old and as tall as his father and learning to set bones from his mother. Cordelia Whitlock was 11 and could already shoot a Sharps carbine off a fence post at 30 paces, the way her grandmother on her father's side had once been able to do. 2 more children had come, a boy named Tobias after his uncle and a girl named Henrietta after Adelaide's own dead mother. Toby Whitlock and Eleanor had 3 children of their own. Ezra and Annabelle had 2 more besides Henry. The Bitterroot Valley, which had been a lonesome country with 1 cabin and a graveyard and a violin on the wall, now had 30 families in it, most of whom had come because a doctor and her husband would not turn man or animal away. The Whitlock Valley Medical Post had become the largest and best-loved practice west of Helena. And on a warm afternoon in May of 1906, 21 years almost to the day after Adelaide Mary Thornberry had stepped down off a stagecoach at Trading Post Junction with a carpet bag and a doctor's satchel and a letter folded soft at the edges. She stood on the porch of the larger house she and Silas had built 200 yards up the meadow from the original cabin, the house they had named Adelaide's Rest, and she watched her grandchildren chase one another through the bitterroot blooms. She was 43 years old. There was silver at her temples. Her hands were not what they had been, but she could still set a bone and she could still bring a baby, and she had not turned a man or an animal away in all the years between. Silas Whitlock came out onto the porch behind her. He was 52. His dark blonde hair had gone almost completely gray. The slate gray eyes were not tired anymore. They had not been tired in 20 years. He laid her shawl across her shoulders. "It is getting cool, laddie." Soon. He stood beside her and watched the children. Toby, who was 50 and still playing his violin and still teaching the children at Bitterroot Junction, now in the schoolhouse his wife had once taught in, was sitting on the grass in the meadow with a small grandchild on each knee. Ezra, who was 54 and who had become, in these later years, the kind of quiet-eyed older man who could sit a horse all morning and play with a baby all afternoon, was leading a fat pony along the fence rail with a very small boy clinging to its mane. Adelaide pulled a small folded paper out of the pocket of her dress. It was a letter. The paper had gone the color of weak tea. The folds were soft. The ink had faded. It was the first letter Tobias Whitlock had ever sent her, 21 years before, the letter that had begun, "My dear Miss Thornbury, I hope you will forgive the awkwardness of this, my hand being more accustomed to an axe than a pen." She had kept it all this time. She read it once the way she read it on every wedding anniversary they had ever had, and she folded it again and she put it back in her pocket. Silas was watching her. Old letter Addie, the first letter. Toby's letter. Toby's letter. He smiled. He did not have to ask why she still carried it. He knew. He had always known. The letter had brought her to this mountain, and the mountain had given her to him. And he was at peace at last with both of those things. And so was Toby, and so was Ezra, and so somewhere was Cordelia. A man keeps his word in Bitterroot. Adelaide had kept hers. She had said she would earn her place, not as a wife only, but as a healer, and she had earned it. Silas had kept his. He had said on a starlit porch on a 90-day trial that he would love her until they put him in the ground and for whatever came after, and he had loved her every single day in between. Toby had kept his. He had said he would play her wedding, and he had played it, and he had played their first child's christening, and he had played the quiet evening songs by the hearth for 20 years on the violin that had once belonged to the wife of a brother he had loved as much as he had ever loved a woman. Ezra had kept his. He had said he would not be responsible for the death of a second woman in this house, and the second woman had become the great living mother of the whole long valley, and the only thing she had ever died of was the small daily work of a long happy life, which was not a death at all. Winter always ends. The Bitterroot always blooms. A man keeps his word in Bitterroot. This is where you belong. You are home now. Down in the meadow, the youngest of Adelaide's grandchildren, a small dark-haired girl named for her great-grandmother, came running across the grass with both her arms wide and a fistful of Bitterroot crushed in one hand, calling at the top of her 4-year-old lungs, "Grandma, Grandma, I picked these for you." Adelaide bent down and held out her hands. She thought for one moment of standing on the platform at Trading Post Junction in the cold blue dusk of November of 1885, with the wolf crying in the timber and the 3 big riders coming out of the trees, and her father's voice in her ears telling her there were good men still and she only had to look. He had been right. He had been right about all of it. She took the Bitterroot blooms from her granddaughter's hand. She bent and she kissed the small warm forehead. She straightened up. She turned to her husband. "Silas Whitlock." "Yes, Addie. That was the day my life began." "What was Addie?" "The day I stepped down off that stage, 21 years ago, the day a wolf cried and I did not have a road back and 3 big strangers came riding out of the timber. That was the day my life began. I did not know it then. I know it now." He put his arm around her shoulders. He did not speak. They stood together on the porch of the house he had built her, watching the last of the long, warm afternoon turn the meadow the color of beaten copper, the way the dawn had turned the sky, the morning the fever came, and the children chased one another through the white blooms, and somewhere at the far end of the meadow by a small picket fence where the wildflowers grew thickest, the violin began to play. It was Toby. It was Adelaide's Spring. It was the song he had written the night she had stepped out onto the porch with another brother, and it was the song he had played at her wedding, and it was the song he had played at the christening of every one of her children, and it was the song he was going to play at her funeral, and at his own, and at the funerals of all of them, in the long order God would call them. Adelaide closed her eyes and listened. Behind her in the doorway of the house, the lamp came on. Inside on the mantelpiece, Cordelia's small leather book sat open at the last page the way Adelaide had left it that morning, the way she left it every morning, so that the woman who had given her this house would always be one of the living souls in it. The Chinook wind blew warm down the long valley. The Bitterroot bloomed white in the meadow. And in the small frontier country of the Bitterroot Range of Montana in the warm spring of 1906, the long story of 3 brothers and the woman who had come west on a letter came at last after winter and fever and gunfire and grief and the long, slow-earned love of a quiet life to the gentle and complete rest it had been promised at the beginning and had earned every single day in between.